Matt Walker had built his life around the principles of hard work and perseverance. Owning 3 investment properties in a thriving suburban neighborhood wasn't just a financial strategy, it was the culmination of years spent scraping together savings and making sacrifices. The houses, each well-maintained and rented out to long-term tenants, represented stability in a world that often felt unstable. For Matt, they were more than just bricks and mortar, they were his safety net and his legacy. Returning home from a week-long business trip, Matt felt that familiar sense of satisfaction as he pulled into the driveway of his modest bungalow. But something was off. A small stack of mail was waiting on the porch, and amidst the usual advertisements and utility bills, 3 thick envelopes stood out. Each was stamped with urgent in bold red letters and addressed to him. Matt's chest tightened as he ripped open the first envelope, revealing a notice from a homeowners organization he'd never even heard of. The letter claimed that all 3 of his properties had outstanding balances for unpaid dues, fines, and late fees. It also stated that liens had been placed on his properties, giving the organization the legal right to pursue foreclosure if the debts were not settled within 30 days. Matt's head spun. This couldn't be real. He'd never joined any such organization. His properties weren't even located in a neighborhood with an HOA. Reading further, Matt saw that the letter referenced recent boundary expansions that supposedly placed his properties within the jurisdiction of the organization. It included vague language about newly enacted bylaws, legal notices, and his failure to comply. The accompanying balance sheet listed thousands of dollars in fabricated charges, maintenance fees, landscaping violations, and penalties for unspecified infractions. By the time he tore open the second and third envelopes, Matt's hands were shaking. The contents were nearly identical, each one targeting one of his rental properties. This wasn't some clerical error, it was a coordinated attack. Confused and furious, Matt threw the letters on the kitchen table and immediately began looking for answers. He called the organization using the phone number provided in the notices. After waiting through 10 minutes of hold music, a curt woman answered. She introduced herself as a compliance representative and listened with barely concealed impatience as Matt explained the situation. When he insisted that his properties were not under any organization's control, her response was chillingly dismissive. "Sir, all properties within the expanded jurisdiction are required to comply with our rules and regulations," she said in a tone that suggested the conversation was already over. "You were notified of these changes in advance. Any disputes can be addressed through legal channels, but until then, the liens remain in place." Matt pressed her for details. When were these changes made? Why hadn't he been informed? But she refused to elaborate, simply repeating the same rehearsed lines. "You can consult with your attorney if you believe there's been a mistake." Hanging up the phone, Matt's frustration turned to dread. The call had confirmed one thing: whoever these people were, they weren't going to back down easily. His next move was to contact the county records office to verify the claims. The clerk he spoke to was polite but firm. The liens were real, and they had been properly filed by the organization in question. They had been placed just a few weeks earlier, shortly after the supposed jurisdictional expansion. "How is that even possible?" Matt asked, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I never agreed to this, and I never received any notice." "Unfortunately, that's something you'll need to take up with the organization directly," the clerk replied sympathetically. "But I'd recommend consulting a property attorney. Cases like these can get complicated." That evening, Matt sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letters and a printout of the lien filings he had pulled from the county's website. The thought of losing his properties, his income, his investments was unthinkable. This wasn't just about money, it was about his future and his freedom. The properties were his lifeline, and he couldn't afford to let anyone take them away. He started researching property laws and legal precedents, quickly realizing he was in over his head. He would need professional help to fight this, and he would need it fast. Early the next morning, Matt contacted an attorney who specialized in real estate disputes. During their consultation, the attorney confirmed what Matt feared most. While the situation was suspicious, the organization had followed just enough legal protocol to make their actions appear legitimate on paper. Undoing the liens would be a time-consuming and costly battle. What they're doing is technically legal, the attorney explained, but it's highly unethical. They're exploiting a loophole in local property laws that allows them to retroactively claim properties after boundary expansions. It's a gray area, but it's going to take a court order to reverse it. Matt's heart sank as the attorney laid out the potential timeline and costs of litigation. Months in court, tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and even then, there was no guarantee of success. The attorney advised him to begin documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every interaction. Matt left the attorney's office with a binder full of documents and a growing sense of unease. He knew he was up against more than just a shady organization. This was a coordinated and well-funded effort to take what was his. Whoever was behind it wasn't just targeting him, they were playing a long game, and they had the resources to do it. As he drove home, Matt's mind raced with questions. Why now? Why his properties? And who stood to gain if he lost them? He had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a fight far bigger than he could have imagined. Matt spent the next few days gathering every piece of documentation he had related to his properties. He sifted through deeds, tax records, and any correspondence he had received since purchasing the houses. Nothing indicated any connection to the organization that had filed the liens. His properties weren't part of any neighborhood development plans, and he had no contracts or agreements with any governing bodies. The whole situation reeked of something underhanded, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Despite his frustration, Matt knew he needed to stay composed. This was no time to act impulsively. He scheduled another meeting with his attorney to dig deeper into the legal implications of the liens and how to fight them. The attorney had already filed a formal dispute on Matt's behalf with the county, which temporarily halted any foreclosure proceedings. But that was just a first step, one that might buy time but didn't solve the larger problem. The organization is banking on you being too overwhelmed or underprepared to challenge them, the attorney said as they reviewed the documentation together. They've likely done this before to other property owners, and they know most people can't afford a lengthy legal battle. Matt's jaw clenched as he stared at the neatly typed letters on the table in front of him. He could feel the weight of what was at stake pressing down on him, but he also knew he wasn't going to let this go without a fight. He needed to understand exactly who he was dealing with and why they were targeting him. After leaving his attorney's office, Matt decided to visit the headquarters of the organization that had filed the liens. It was a small, nondescript building in a strip mall on the edge of town, the kind of place you might expect to see a tax preparation service or a payday loan company. The sign out front bore the organization's name in blocky, unremarkable lettering. As Matt entered, the receptionist barely looked up from her computer. The air inside was cold and sterile, and the hum of a nearby printer filled the silence. Matt approached the desk, gripping the stack of papers he'd brought with him. "I'm here to speak with someone about these liens that were placed on my properties," he said, his voice calm but firm. The receptionist glanced up, her expression neutral. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't have an appointment," Matt replied, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "But I need to speak with someone immediately. This is urgent." The receptionist sighed and picked up the phone, dialing a number without much enthusiasm. After a brief conversation, she hung up and gestured toward a door at the far end of the room. "Someone will see you. Third door on the right." Matt made his way down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The third door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open to reveal a modest conference room. A man in a tailored suit sat at the head of the table, flipping through a clipboard. He looked up as Matt entered, offering a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must be Mr. Walker," the man said, rising to extend a hand. "I'm David Nolan, the director here. Please have a seat." Matt didn't return the smile. He sat down across from Nolan, placing his stack of papers on the table. "I'm here to find out why your organization has placed liens on my properties. As far as I'm concerned, this is completely unfounded." Nolan leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Walker. Changes like this can often come as a surprise. But I assure you, everything we've done is entirely within the bounds of the law. Then explain to me how you have any authority over my properties, Matt said, his voice steady but sharp. They've never been part of any association or jurisdiction under your control. Nolan picked up the clipboard and flipped through it with exaggerated care. Ah, yes, your properties were incorporated into our jurisdiction as part of a boundary expansion last year. Notifications were sent out to all affected property owners, including yourself. That's a lie, Matt snapped. I never received any notifications. You can't just expand your boundaries and start placing liens on people's homes without their consent. I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Nolan replied smoothly. Under local property statutes, boundary expansions can be enacted with the approval of the Municipal Planning Board. Once the expansion is approved, all properties within the new boundaries automatically fall under our governance. We followed all the proper procedures. Matt could hardly believe what he was hearing. So you're telling me I don't have a choice in this? That I'm just supposed to accept that my properties are now under your control because of some obscure rule no one bothered to inform me about? Nolan's smile faltered slightly, and a hint of condescension crept into his tone. Mr. Walker, I understand this is upsetting, but our goal is simply to maintain the community's standards and ensure that all properties are contributing fairly to its upkeep. If you're struggling with the fees, we're happy to discuss a payment plan. Matt stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not paying you a dime. This is extortion, plain and simple. You can expect to hear from my attorney. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the room, his heart pounding. As he left the building, Nolan's voice followed him down the hallway. I'd advise you to think carefully about your next steps, Mr. Walker. Fighting us might not be in your best interest. Back in his car, Matt gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. It was clear now that this wasn't just about money or dues, this was a calculated attempt to force him into submission. But why? What was it about his properties that made them so valuable to these people? Over the next few days, Matt began to notice strange things happening around his houses. A tenant called to report that a group of surveyors had shown up unannounced, claiming they needed to take measurements for a community project. Another tenant found an unmarked envelope in their mailbox containing a vague but unsettling note: some investments aren't worth the trouble. Matt's frustration turned to unease as the incidents continued. One morning, he found a bright orange sticker on the front door of one of his properties. It claimed the house was in violation of community standards and warned of escalating fines if the issue wasn't resolved. The supposed violation? Unauthorized exterior paint color. Matt knew this was nonsense. The house had been the same color since he'd bought it years ago. The more he investigated, the more it became clear that this organization wasn't just trying to collect fees, they were trying to push him out entirely. Whether through legal pressure, harassment, or intimidation, they were determined to make his life as difficult as possible. But Matt wasn't about to roll over and let them take what he'd worked so hard to build. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And he was just getting started. Matt's resolve to fight back hardened after his encounter with David Nolan and the strange incidents surrounding his properties. The next morning, he met with his attorney to strategize their next steps. They had already filed a dispute with the county clerk to challenge the validity of the liens, but the process was slow, and the organization seemed to have anticipated every possible counter. Matt explained the recent harassment surveyors trespassing, the orange violation sticker, and the vague threats left for his tenants. His attorney frowned, clearly troubled. They're trying to intimidate you into giving up, she said. The violation notice and the surveyors? Those are classic scare tactics, but they wouldn't bother if they didn't stand to gain something significant from this. What do they want? Matt asked, though he had a sinking suspicion. I mean, why me? What's so special about my properties? It could be the land, the attorney replied. It's common for organizations like this to target properties in areas slated for future development, but without solid proof of their motives, it's hard to say. For now, we need to focus on protecting your rights. Have you installed security cameras at your properties yet? Matt shook his head. He'd considered it, but the idea of escalating tensions worried him. Won't that make things worse? If they see cameras, won't they just retaliate? Possibly, she admitted. But you need to document everything. If they set foot on your property again, you'll have evidence to back up any legal action we take. These people are counting on you being unprepared. Don't give them that advantage." Taking her advice to heart, Matt went to a local electronics store later that day and purchased several motion-activated cameras. He spent the rest of the evening installing them around his rental properties, making sure to cover key areas like entrances, driveways, and backyards. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet suburban neighborhood felt unnaturally still, the usual hum of life replaced by an eerie silence. The next morning, Matt's phone buzzed with an alert from one of the cameras. Checking the footage, he saw a white van parked in front of one of his properties. Two men in work uniforms stepped out, carrying clipboards and tools. They walked up to the house and began inspecting the exterior, even attempting to peer through the windows. Matt's blood boiled. He hadn't authorized any inspections, and his tenants hadn't mentioned requesting repairs. These men were trespassing. He called the tenant living in the house to confirm, and they were just as surprised as he was. "I thought you sent them," the tenant said. "They didn't knock or anything. Just started walking around like they owned the place." Matt wasted no time. He drove straight to the property, but by the time he arrived, the van was gone. Frustrated, he reviewed the camera footage again, noting the company logo on the men's uniforms. He quickly searched the name online and found that it was a contracting firm with ties to local developers. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Whoever was behind this harassment wanted him out, and they weren't afraid to bend the rules to make it happen. Later that day, Matt received a call from another tenant. This time, it wasn't about surveyors or strange inspectors. The tenant reported that their water pressure had suddenly dropped, and when they checked the backyard, they found that the main water valve had been tampered with. Someone had partially closed it, leaving them without a consistent supply of water. By the time Matt arrived to inspect the damage, the tenant had already called a plumber to fix the issue. The plumber confirmed that the valve had been intentionally manipulated. "This wasn't an accident," the plumber said. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Matt's frustration reached a boiling point. It was clear now that these weren't isolated incidents. They were calculated moves meant to destabilize his properties, unsettle his tenants, and force him into a corner. He called his attorney again, detailing the latest events. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "We need to bring this to the authorities." Matt wasn't so sure. The last time he'd contacted the police, they'd been polite but dismissive, claiming there wasn't enough evidence to take action. Without clear proof of who was behind the harassment, it felt like a dead end. Still, his attorney insisted on filing a report, if only to establish a paper trail. As the days passed, the harassment continued to escalate. Another orange sticker appeared, this time citing overgrown vegetation as the violation. The problem? There was no overgrown vegetation. Matt's landscaping was immaculate, and the tenants confirmed they had kept everything in order. When Matt tried to confront David Nolan about the sticker, he was met with the same smug indifference as before. "I'm afraid I can't help you," Nolan said, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "Our compliance team handles all violations. If you believe there's been a mistake, you're welcome to appeal through the proper channels." The appeal process, Matt quickly learned, was a bureaucratic nightmare. It involved endless forms, fees, and waiting periods, all designed to frustrate and discourage property owners. Every time he tried to push back, it felt like he was running into a wall. But Matt wasn't about to give up. He began reaching out to other property owners in the area, hoping to find someone who had faced similar issues. To his surprise, a few of them were willing to talk. One neighbor, an elderly man named Henry, revealed that he had been forced to sell his home to the same organization after months of similar harassment. "They wore me down," Henry admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It started small violation notices, late fees, random inspections. Then they started messing with my utilities, sending people to inspect my property without permission. By the time they placed a lien on my house, I couldn't afford to fight them anymore." Hearing Henry's story only fueled Matt's determination. He wasn't going to let these people bully him into submission, but the more he dug, the more he realized how deeply entrenched the organization was in the local government and development scene. They had connections, money, and influence, all the tools they needed to crush anyone who stood in their way. One evening, as Matt was reviewing footage from his cameras, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. In the corner of one frame, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure standing just beyond the fence line of one of his properties. The person wasn't moving, just watching. Matt rewound the footage and zoomed in, but the image was too grainy to make out any details. Whoever it was, they were gone by the time the next clip started. The realization that someone was surveilling his properties in person sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just harassment, it was a calculated campaign to drive him out. As Matt sat in his car outside one of his houses that night, he made a silent vow. They might have money, influence, and power, but he wasn't going to roll over. He was going to fight back, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. This was his property, his livelihood, and his future, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. Matt's patience was wearing thin. The relentless harassment, the cryptic threats, and the legal roadblocks had all but consumed his life. Every day seemed to bring a new problem, another violation notice, another tenant calling to report strange activity near one of the properties, another email from his attorney detailing the slow grind of legal filings. Despite his resolve to fight back, the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. The latest incident pushed him closer to the edge. Early one morning, Matt received a frantic call from one of his tenants. Their home had been vandalized, overnight graffiti sprayed across the side of the house in bold, black letters, "Leave while you can." The tenants, a young couple with 2 small children, were terrified. They asked if they could break their lease and move out immediately. Matt arrived at the property within an hour. The sight of the vandalism, his property defaced, his tenants driven to fear, ignited a fury he could barely contain. He reassured the couple that he would cover the costs of the cleanup and even offered to pay for a security system to help them feel safer. But it was clear their minds were already made up. "This isn't worth it," Matt, the husband, said, shaking his head. "We've got kids to think about. We can't stay somewhere that feels unsafe." As Matt watched them pack their car and drive away later that afternoon, he felt a sinking sense of failure. The organization was winning. They were systematically tearing apart his life, one piece at a time. And yet, as much as he wanted to rage or despair, he couldn't afford to. He had to keep moving forward. That evening, Matt met with his attorney to discuss the latest developments. The graffiti, while disturbing, wasn't enough to prove who was behind the harassment. Without direct evidence linking the organization to the act, it was just another incident to add to an already long list of grievances. "We need something concrete," his attorney said, her tone heavy with frustration. "If we can prove that they're behind this, we'll have a much stronger case. Right now, all we have is circumstantial evidence." "What about the lien filings?" Matt asked. "Isn't there anything in the paperwork we can use against them?" The attorney hesitated before answering. "There is one thing," she said slowly. "I've been reviewing the documents and I noticed something odd. The boundaries they're claiming as part of their jurisdiction, your properties fall within them, but there's no record of how those boundaries were approved. Normally, a boundary expansion like this would require a public hearing, followed by a vote from the municipal planning board. I can't find any record of that happening." Matt frowned. "So what does that mean? Can we use it to invalidate the liens?" "Not yet," she replied. "It's suspicious, but it's not definitive proof of wrongdoing. We need to dig deeper, find out if they bypassed the legal process entirely or if they manipulated the system somehow. Either way, it gives us a direction to investigate." The next day, Matt decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to the county records office and requested access to any documents related to the boundary expansion. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, spent nearly an hour searching through files before returning with a thin folder. "This is all we have on the expansion," she said, sliding the folder across the counter. Matt opened it and immediately noticed how sparse the documentation was. There were only a handful of pages of vague map outlining the new boundaries, a memorandum from the organization citing community development needs, and a single sheet signed by a municipal official approving the expansion. The approval form was dated nearly a year ago, but there was no accompanying evidence of a public hearing or community vote. "Is this normal?" Matt asked, holding up the form. The clerk shrugged. Not really. Usually there'd be meeting minutes, public notices, that sort of thing. But sometimes things get pushed through quietly, especially if there's no opposition. Matt's frustration grew as he flipped through the papers. It was clear that the organization had manipulated the system to get what they wanted, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Still, the discovery gave him a glimmer of hope. If he could uncover the truth behind the boundary expansion, he might be able to dismantle their entire scheme. Later that evening, Matt received an unexpected email from a tenant living in one of his other properties. Attached was a photo of a small, metal device they had found buried in the backyard. The device was rectangular, about the size of a deck of cards, with a small antenna sticking out of the top. "I have no idea what this is," the tenant wrote. "It was sticking out of the ground near the fence. Thought you should know." Matt stared at the photo, a sense of unease creeping over him. He forwarded it to his attorney and then called a friend who worked in construction to ask if he'd ever seen anything like it. The friend identified it as a wireless sensor, typically used for monitoring soil or environmental conditions. "Why would someone put one of these in my tenant's yard?" Matt asked, his voice tight with anger. "Good question," the friend replied. "But if I had to guess, someone's gathering data. Could be for a development project, or maybe they're checking for contamination. Either way, it's definitely not something you'd expect to find in a residential backyard." Matt's mind raced. This had to be connected to the organization's efforts to take his properties. They weren't just trying to push him out, they were gathering information, possibly to justify a larger development plan. But how far were they willing to go? The next morning, Matt returned to the property to retrieve the device himself. As he dug it out of the ground, he noticed something else, a faint trail of disturbed soil leading toward the edge of the yard. Following the trail, he discovered a second device, identical to the first. Whoever had placed them hadn't even bothered to hide their tracks. Matt handed both devices over to his attorney, who promised to include them in their ongoing case. But even as they continued to build their legal argument, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that he was being outmaneuvered. The organization had resources he couldn't match: lawyers, contractors, connections in local government. Fighting them felt like trying to stop a tidal wave with a sandbag. As the weeks wore on, Matt found himself growing increasingly paranoid. He started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near his properties, their occupants seemingly doing nothing but sitting and watching. Tenants began reporting more incidents of strange behavior: people knocking on their doors late at night, vehicles idling in the street for hours, and more notes warning them to leave. One evening, Matt was reviewing footage from the security cameras he'd installed when he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the video, a man in a dark hoodie was standing at the edge of one of his properties, holding what appeared to be a can of spray paint. The man glanced around nervously before scrawling something on the fence. The footage was grainy, and the man's face was obscured, but Matt recognized the graffiti as the same threatening message that had been left on his other property: "Leave while you can." Matt immediately sent the footage to his attorney, who advised him to file another police report. But deep down, he knew the police wouldn't be able to do much. Without a clear link between the vandals and the organization, it was just another dead end. As Matt sat in his car later that night, parked outside one of his vandalized properties, he felt a gnawing sense of helplessness. He had done everything right: hired an attorney, documented the harassment, followed the legal process, and yet it still felt like he was losing. But as much as he wanted to give in to despair, he couldn't afford to. The stakes were too high. These weren't just investments, they were his future, his livelihood, and he wasn't going to let anyone take them away. Somehow he would find a way to turn the tide. He had to. Matt's fight against the organization was becoming an all-consuming war, and it was clear they were escalating their efforts to push him out. Despite the mounting harassment, Matt's determination burned brighter. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, consulting with his attorney, and filing reports with the police, but the organization seemed untouchable. Each step forward was met with new obstacles, as if they were always one move ahead. One morning, Matt's attorney called with troubling news. "They filed a countersuit," she said grimly. "They're claiming that you've been neglecting your properties and violating local safety codes. They're demanding an injunction to force you to make necessary improvements or face additional fines. Matt's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. My properties are in better shape than most of the homes around here. They're targeting me because I'm fighting back. I know, she said, but this complicates things. If the court grants the injunction, it could cost you thousands of dollars in immediate repairs, whether the claims are legitimate or not. They're using the legal system to drain your resources. Matt took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was a calculated attempt to wear him down financially and mentally. He couldn't let them succeed. Later that day, Matt visited one of his properties to reassure his tenants that everything was under control. As he arrived, he noticed something unusual: a group of workers in reflective vests standing near the edge of the property line. They were unloading equipment from a truck, including surveying tools and what looked like ground-penetrating radar. Matt approached them, his frustration barely concealed. "What's going on here? Who authorized this?" One of the workers looked up, clearly uncomfortable. "We're conducting a survey. Got a work order from the community management office." "This is private property," Matt said firmly. "You're trespassing. Pack up your equipment and leave." The worker hesitated but eventually nodded, signaling to his team to stop. As they loaded their equipment back into the truck, Matt noticed a familiar logo on the side of the vehicle. It was the same contracting company he'd seen on the uniforms of the men who had trespassed on his property weeks earlier. As the truck drove off, Matt's phone buzzed with an alert from his attorney. She had been reviewing the countersuit and discovered something that made his stomach drop. "Matt, you're not going to like this," she said. "They're claiming that your properties pose environmental hazards. Specifically, they're citing potential contamination in the soil and groundwater. If they can get the court to issue a ruling based on that, they could force you to vacate the properties entirely." "That's insane," Matt replied, his voice rising. "There's no contamination. They're making this up to get rid of me." "I know," she said, "but they've hired a team of environmental consultants to back up their claims. If they've planted something on your properties to support their case, we'll need to disprove it. I suggest we bring in our own expert to conduct independent testing." Matt agreed, though the thought of yet another expense made his stomach churn. He hired an environmental consultant who spent 2 days testing the soil and water around his properties. When the results came back, Matt felt a brief surge of relief. The tests showed no signs of contamination, directly contradicting the organization's claims. But the relief was short-lived. Just as Matt was preparing to use the test results in court, he received a notice from the county health department. The notice claimed that an anonymous complaint had been filed against one of his properties, citing unsafe living conditions, and demanding an inspection. The inspector arrived the next day, accompanied by 2 county officials. Matt followed them through the property, watching as they scrutinized every inch of the house. By the time they finished, they had compiled a list of supposed violations, ranging from minor cosmetic issues to exaggerated claims about structural integrity. "This is a coordinated attack," Matt said to his attorney later that evening. "They're using every tool they have to make my life miserable. They're trying to bury me under red tape and legal fees." His attorney nodded grimly. "They're playing dirty, Matt. But we're starting to build a strong case against them. Between the environmental test results, the harassment your tenants have documented, and the lack of proper approval for the boundary expansion, we're getting closer to exposing their tactics." Despite her words, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The organization's pressure tactics were taking a toll, not just on him but on his tenants as well. One of them, a single mother with 2 young children, called Matt in tears, saying she'd found a warning notice taped to her front door. The notice claimed that the house was scheduled for review under community safety standards and advised her to relocate temporarily. "They're trying to scare you," Matt told her, his voice firm. "You don't need to go anywhere. I'll handle this." But even as he reassured her, he wondered how much longer he could keep fighting. The organization had resources and connections he couldn't match. They were exploiting every legal and bureaucratic loophole they could find, and Matt was running out of options. The breaking point came late one night when Matt was reviewing footage from the security cameras he had installed around his properties. In one clip, he saw a shadowy figure moving along the fence line of one of the houses. The person crouched down, fiddling with something on the ground before slipping away into the darkness. The next morning, Matt went to investigate and found a small metallic device buried in the dirt near the property line. It was similar to the wireless sensor his tenant had found weeks earlier, but this one was more advanced. Matt called his environmental consultant, who examined the device and confirmed his worst fears. "This is a contaminant sensor," the consultant said. "It's designed to detect specific chemicals in the soil. If someone were to introduce contaminants into the ground, this device could be used to generate evidence of pollution." Matt's blood ran cold. "Are you saying they're planting evidence to frame me?" "It's possible," the consultant said. "If they can create the appearance of contamination, it would support their case in court and give them grounds to force you off the property." Matt felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just harassment, it was outright sabotage. They were willing to break the law, manipulate evidence, and destroy his livelihood to achieve their goals. Fueled by fury, Matt took the device to his attorney and insisted they file a motion to subpoena the organization's records. "If they're planting these devices, there has to be a trail," he said. "Emails, work orders, something. We need to expose them." His attorney agreed, but warned him that the process would be slow. "They'll fight this every step of the way," she said. "But if we can prove they're falsifying evidence, it could turn the entire case in our favor." As Matt left her office that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The organization might have resources and influence, but they had underestimated him. He wasn't just fighting for his properties anymore, he was fighting to expose the corruption at the heart of their operation. And he wasn't going to stop until he won. Matt walked into the courtroom with a heavy binder in one hand and his attorney, Sarah, by his side. The months leading up to this moment had been relentless, a grueling battle of intimidation, sabotage, and legal maneuvering. But now, standing in front of the judge, Matt finally felt like the tide might turn. The evidence they had gathered was damning, and Sarah had assured him that their case was stronger than ever. Still, Matt knew better than to underestimate his opponents. The organization's attorney, a polished man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, opened with the same rehearsed arguments they had been peddling for months. He painted Matt as a negligent property owner, someone who ignored community standards and resisted efforts to maintain neighborhood safety. He waved documents alleging contamination and safety hazards, presenting them as irrefutable proof that Matt's properties were a danger to the public. When Sarah stood to respond, her calm, measured voice filled the courtroom. She began dismantling their claims piece by piece, starting with the so-called contamination evidence. Using reports from the independent environmental consultant, she demonstrated that the soil and groundwater at Matt's properties were clean. Then she presented the device Matt had found buried near one of the properties, explaining how it had been placed there intentionally to fabricate a false narrative of environmental hazards. "The organization is not acting in good faith," Sarah said, her voice rising with conviction. "They are using fraudulent tactics to force my client out of his legally owned properties. This is not about community standards, it's about profit." The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable, as Sarah continued. She presented emails obtained through the subpoena, which revealed a coordinated effort between the organization and a local development company. The emails included detailed discussions about expanding the boundaries to include Matt's properties, with explicit references to their value as part of a larger redevelopment project. One email, dated just weeks before the liens were filed, stood out. It was from David Nolan, the director of the organization, to the development company's CEO. The subject line read, "Final Push." In the body of the email, Nolan wrote, "Once the Walker properties are under our control, we'll have the leverage we need to move forward. Ensure there are no loose ends." Matt felt a surge of satisfaction as the words were read aloud in court. This was the smoking gun they had been searching for, proof that the organization's actions were driven by greed and malice. The organization's attorney tried to recover, arguing that the boundary expansion and the liens were legitimate under local statutes. But Sarah was ready. She presented evidence showing that the boundary expansion had bypassed the required public hearing process. She pointed to irregularities in the approval documents, including signatures from municipal officials who had since retired and denied ever approving the expansion. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Sarah methodically dismantled their case. Even the judge seemed unimpressed by the organization's attempts to defend their actions. But Matt knew they weren't finished yet. Just as Sarah finished her presentation, the organization's attorney stood again, his demeanor shifting from confident to aggressive. He claimed that Matt's resistance to the organization's rules had caused chaos in the community, citing complaints from other property owners as evidence. But Sarah was ready for this, too. She presented statements from several of Matt's tenants and neighbors, who testified that the organization had engaged in harassment and intimidation tactics. One tenant described finding threatening notes taped to their door, while another recounted how contractors had trespassed on their property without permission. The final blow came when Sarah called a surprise witness, a former employee of the organization who had reached out to Matt anonymously weeks earlier. The witness, a middle-aged woman named Karen, had worked in the organization's compliance department before resigning in disgust. "I couldn't be part of it anymore," Karen said, her voice trembling slightly as she took the stand. "They targeted Mr. Walker because his properties were valuable. They falsified violation notices, planted those sensors, and did everything they could to make his life miserable. It was all part of their plan to force him to sell." Karen's testimony was the nail in the coffin. By the time she finished, the organization's attorney looked visibly shaken, and Nolan, who had been sitting silently in the back of the courtroom, avoided eye contact with anyone. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was firm and deliberate. "The evidence presented today paints a clear picture of unethical and potentially illegal actions by the organization. The liens on Mr. Walker's properties are hereby voided, and I am recommending that this case be referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation." Relief washed over Matt as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing. The battle was over, and he had won. But as Matt gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he noticed Nolan whispering to his attorney. The look on Nolan's face wasn't one of defeat, it was one of cold calculation. Outside the courthouse, Sarah turned to Matt, her expression a mix of relief and caution. This was a big win, but it might not be the end. If they're willing to go this far, they might try something else. Stay vigilant. Matt nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had fought hard to protect his properties, and while he had won this round, he knew his enemies weren't likely to give up so easily. Still, for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. As he walked to his car, he made a silent promise to himself he wouldn't let anyone take away what he had built. Not now, not ever. In the weeks following the courtroom victory, Matt felt the weight of the long battle begin to lift, though the scars of the conflict remained. His properties were safe for now, the liens voided, and the organization's schemes exposed. Tenants who had considered leaving began to settle back into their routines, reassured by the outcome. Matt took it upon himself to repair the damage caused during the fight, both physically and emotionally. The first order of business was fixing the vandalism and restoring his properties to their former state. He hired contractors to repaint the graffiti-stained walls, repair broken fences, and install new security systems. Matt made sure to personally oversee the work, determined to show his tenants that their homes and their safety were his priority. He also upgraded the lighting and added visible cameras to deter any future intrusions. Though the immediate threats seemed to have subsided, Matt wasn't naive. He knew the organization might regroup or try a different tactic. David Nolan, the man who had orchestrated much of the harassment, had vanished from public view after the court case, but Matt was certain he wasn't gone for good. The final look on Nolan's face in the courtroom, cold, calculating, and devoid of remorse, was a constant reminder that the fight might not truly be over. One day Matt received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed in bold font, "You may have won this time," but we don't forget there was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it, but Matt didn't need one. It was a message meant to rattle him, to keep him on edge. Instead of fear, the letter filled Matt with renewed determination. He wasn't the same person he'd been at the start of this ordeal. The months of fighting had sharpened his resolve and taught him the importance of vigilance and preparation. If they wanted to come at him again, he'd be ready. To protect himself and his properties going forward, Matt worked with his attorney to establish a legal trust that would make it harder for anyone to target him personally. He also joined a coalition of local property owners who had faced similar issues, forming a united front against any future abuses. Together, they shared resources, legal advice, and strategies for dealing with harassment. Despite the lingering tension, life slowly began to normalize. Matt held a barbecue for his tenants and a few supportive neighbors, a small celebration of their collective resilience. As they gathered in one of the freshly restored backyards, laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had hung over them just weeks earlier. In quieter moments, Matt reflected on what he'd been through. The fight had tested him in ways he never anticipated, forcing him to confront not just the external threats to his livelihood but also his own limits. He realized how close he had come to giving up at times, and how much he had relied on the support of his attorney, his tenants, and even the anonymous whistleblower who had stepped forward. The battle had changed him. He was no longer just a property owner, he had become an advocate, someone who understood the importance of standing up not only for himself but for others who might not have the resources or courage to do so. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Matt allowed himself a rare moment of peace. His properties were still standing, his tenants were safe, and the organization's power had been diminished. He knew there were no guarantees that they wouldn't try again, but for now he was content with the knowledge that he had fought back and won. And if they ever came for him again, he'd be ready to fight once more.